Welcome, everyone. My name is Marina Shafiq. I'm from St. Mark's, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'm here speaking a little bit to Father Daniel. Welcome, Father Daniel.
Pleasure to be here, Marina. Thank you.
And he's from St. Maurice and St. Farina in Toronto. So we're going to be speaking a little bit about finding your future life partner and discussing some of the things. So, Father, can you please tell us some of these steps in finding your future partner?
Basically, when you're going to choose a life partner, you need to ask yourself 3 key questions. Am I being a myth buster? And am I making a list? And am I asking good questions?
Okay, well, Buna, I'd really like to focus on how to be a myth buster today. So can you tell me a little bit more on what a myth buster is?
Yeah, a myth buster is someone who busts myths. A myth is a half-truth. It's a half-truth, and when we bust myths, we learn to discern the difference between biblical truth and what the world teaches us, which is not always truth.
So can you tell me a little bit more about some myths that we may encounter in just interactions with people, and especially when it comes to choosing a potential life partner?
Yeah, so what is a myth? Like, a myth is a half-truth, right? It's something that is a statement that sounds true and is partially true, but is not all true. And what we need to understand is that's really how the devil works. He gives us a half-truth, which amounts for a Christian to a lie, but a half-truth is easier to maybe consider. And that's why the devil presents it to us in this attractive manner. We want to study information that is being presented to us as Christian believers, and we want to ask ourselves if that information is true and useful for us. So we look at the myths that are out here in the world, and we make decisions about, you know, what it is we're going to say and what it is we're going to do and how we're going to live out our lives. When we combat a myth, we do so by being informed through the Word of God and through the teachings of the Church. There are a lot of common myths out there. And I think that when we look at them, we can begin to discuss and study how to respond to them.
Okay, so can you tell me a little bit about certain myths that people may encounter if they're single?
Yeah, sure. So one of the most common myths is all that is needed in my future life partner is that he or she loves God. If he or she loves God, then everything's going to be good. If I love God and she loves God, our marriage cannot fail. That's a myth.
Can you tell me a little bit about why that would be considered a myth? It sounds pretty convincing.
It does. It sounds convincing. I'll tell you, it's a myth because there's so much more that's involved in the decision. I mean, one question you've got to ask yourself is God calling this person to be with me? And am I called to be with this person? In other words, is it God's will that we be together? So God's will needs to enter the equation. You may love God and I may love God, but if God wills that a plan for you to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future is in the country of Kenya, and God's plan for me is to be in the country of Canada, then we both love God and we're both serving God, but it's not His will for us to be together. So you see, there are layers to the question. And sometimes we think that it can be a very simple recipe. You love God, I love God, and we're all good and we're all set. There are personality considerations, personality differences, right, to consider. And I could be an introvert and you could be an extrovert. Now, opposites attract, and that's a good thing, and generally it can work, and there are many couples who are married who are opposite in their personality and their nature. But personality differences play a role in the decision and whether it's best for us to be together. Personal interests, physical attraction, emotional and spiritual maturity, levels of spiritual maturity and levels of commitment. Those are all considerations. It's not merely that I love God and that you love God. It's so much deeper.
That sounds interesting. I never considered the different layers that come into a relationship. It just seems like, you know, if you love God and I love God, then that's one of the biggest milestones that you already have to hit in a relationship. Can you tell me any other myths that people can encounter, especially when they're searching?
Yeah. Another myth is if she goes to church or if he goes to church, he or she must be a Christian. But that's not true, because the church is a hospital for the sick, right? It's not a museum of the righteous. If we believe that a hospital is a museum for righteous people, then maybe underlying assumptions can be made. But in fact, if the church is a place where anyone is welcome at any time to come and to see God or to hear of God or in search of God, it means that people come into the church at different levels of spirituality and quite possibly searching for who the true God is. A searcher is not a believer, right? Consider the liturgy and its structure and how it's divided. You have the liturgy of the believers, and you also have the liturgy of the Word, and you have these sections. The church knew from the very beginning of time that not everyone who comes into the church is going to be a believer. And when we offer the sacraments and people are in the church, what we do is we welcome only those who are believers and who are baptized in the faith to come and partake of the sacraments. So not everyone who enters a church is a believer. And that's why we need to be very careful not to assume that anyone who comes to church is a believer. One of the easiest ways to remember this is going to McDonald's does not make me Ronald McDonald, right? I can walk into McDonald's and order something, but that doesn't make me Ronald McDonald. Merely presenting myself in a location doesn't make me that person or that place.
So I guess there's a lot of work that has to be done to differentiate between a person who just, goes to church and a person who actually partakes in the sacraments and really lives the life of Christ and can definitely call themselves a Christian.
That's right. That's right. And there are levels of commitment that are needing to be considered as well.
So can we talk about any other myths that you may have?
Sure, there are so many, and I hope we can touch on the high points. Another one is, this one is one of my favorites. Sometimes people will come up to me and say, Father Daniel, I'm really afraid that if I submit to God's will and I ask God, Lord, will you choose for me a life partner, that He's going to give me a narrow-minded, stuffy, boring, lame man. And I'm going to be so unhappy, and I'll have to take him because I asked God for him, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And that's just not true. It's a half-lie. You see, the devil doesn't want us to go to God and submit our lives to Him, because God may give us amazing, amazing results. And the devil doesn't want us to have amazing results. The devil doesn't want us to experience the freedom of surrendering to God, just going up on the precipice of faith and just leaping out and saying, God, I give myself to you and I trust in you, and just being awed by what He gives you. So the devil would rather fill your heart and your mind with fear, and you be afraid of what this amazing man or this amazing woman could be that God would give. So that's a great common myth. I want everybody to know that when you submit to God and you give God your heart and your life, He's a Father who loves you and He wants to give you good things. And that includes a great guy or a great girl.
Well, I think a big thing of that we have to combat, I guess, within ourselves is just being able to completely trust and completely surrender before we're able to, I guess, surrender or give our hearts to someone else. We have to first give our hearts to God. And if we don't do that, then the search kind of becomes meaningless, I should say. Because how can you give your heart to someone if God didn't have it first, right?
That's right.
And I'm assuming that, if it comes to a partner, that partner also has to have gone through the same process.
Yeah. Another one that comes to mind is, let's say we're seeing somebody and we're in a relationship, and it's a preliminary kind of courtship relationship. We're not at the stage of engagement. We're just getting to know one another. And we notice that things in the relationship are really stressful, and there's tension between us, and things aren't going smoothly. One common myth is, things are stressful right now, but when we get married, everything's going to be much better, and it's going to just go much more smoothly. And that's not true. And the fact is, when you get married, your life is going to be more stressful.
Oh my.
And so you need to understand that if things are not moving well now before you engage, they're not going to get better when you engage, and they're not going to get better still when you marry. So you need to notice, be mindful and be aware and notice everything that's going on in the relationship and use these as signs. You know, when things are not moving smoothly in our relationship, it could mean that we're not meant for each other. It could mean that God is sending up signs and signals of incompatibility, or that we're being called in different directions.
So it's really good that you brought that up, actually, because the next thing I wanted to ask you is, when you were in that courting stage, how many myths can we encounter, and what exactly can we expect to run into, especially when it comes to half-truths? Can you tell me another one?
Another good one is, if the guy or the girl comes from a good family, that means he or she must be a good person. That's not true. That's not necessarily true. We need to look at the person as an individual, right? I mean, think about the Bible and what the Bible teaches us. You know, Abraham had sons, and Isaac had sons, and Jacob had sons. King David had brothers, and Saul had sons. Is it really safe to say that you would want your son or daughter to marry any one of those men just because they were from these righteous families? And the answer, of course, is no. We need to study a person as a person first and consider the background, the family background, as icing on the cake, bonus. That's the safer approach.
Okay, because then I'm assuming when you associate, you just come to assumptions about how their family must act, and therefore how they act, or how their family solves problems and that's how they solve problems. And while our family may inform certain things about us, we learn and we adapt, and you know, there are different experiences that your family can't really shape. And I guess you're right, the safer approach would be just to simply ask these questions to the person themselves instead of jumping to assumptions based on their surroundings. So do you have any more advice or certain myths that you can encounter when you're kind of interacting with that person?
I would encourage, in the process of seeking out your life partner, or when you are courting, to be deep in the sacrament of confession, and to ask the person that you're with whether he or she has a spiritual father, and to ask whether they are in regular confession, and to encourage it if they are not yet in regular confession. And that's really important. The sacrament of confession is enlightening and is transforming. The sacrament of confession is a sacrament we come to grow through pain, and to change and to be transformed, not by our own power, not by our own will, but by God's grace. When I am in confession, I am invariably growing. So it's powerful, and it's very, very necessary to keep up with.
Would you say that the sacrament of confession grows less necessary as your relationship takes further steps? You know, past courting, so when you're engaged, and then past engagement when you're married. Is it necessary still?
Yeah, it is. And one of the common myths that we want to be busting is that the more advanced we are in our relationship in marriage, the less we need confession. Nothing could be further from the truth. Because when I join my spouse in holy matrimony, I am bonding to a sinner. And I myself am a sinner. And I cannot expect reasonably that when I unite two sinners together, that we are not going to have a storm, and we are not going to have problems that require a cleansing in the sacrament of confession. So more and more and more we will need confession, not less and less and less. And I long to see more and more married couples recognize that and come willingly and lovingly to the sacrament of confession and say, I have sinned against God, I have sinned against my spouse, I've sinned against my children, and here are the ways in which I've done it. Sometimes we just merely say, I'm sorry, and think that's all that's necessary. But I think that if we want to grow and be ministering in the marriage sacrament, we need confession. Abba Sarmatis once said, "I prefer a person who has sinned if he knows that he sinned and has repented over any person who has not sinned and considers him or herself to be righteous." And that's from the wisdom of the fathers. We have a great deal to learn from the wisdom of the fathers. And the sacrament of confession is just essential, whether we are searching for a spouse, whether we are engaged, or whether we are married.
Thank you to everyone for taking the time to view this. Please tune in next time and we'll have a lot more myths to discuss and to bust.